The mud had a life of its own. It was a cold, thick, living thing that clung to the leather of his boots and sucked at his ankles with every step. Jim Thompson, a man who had spent his life with his hands in the rich, black soil of a Kansas farm, had come to hate the feel of this French earth. Here, it was not the giver of life, but a tomb, a graveyard of lost things and forgotten men. In the suffocating air of the trench, a symphony of decay hung heavy. The sour tang of mildewed canvas, the metallic scent of damp rust, the stale odor of unwashed men huddled against the cold. Jim wiped a smear of grit from the action of his M1917 Enfield rifle with a meticulous care that felt like a ritual, a silent prayer for a life he once knew. He closed his eyes, and for a single fleeting moment, he was not in this hole in the ground. He was back in Kansas. The sun a warm weight on his shoulders, the clean wind whispering through the stalks of corn. He could almost feel the dry, dusty give of his own soil beneath his worn work boots, a world away from the slick, treacherous mud that now caked his trousers. He remembered the simple, honest work of tending to the fields, a clear line from effort to reward. Here, the only reward for digging was the promise of a deeper grave. "Keep your head down, farmer," a voice rumbled, shaking him from his thoughts. Sergeant Miller was a man of few words and numb nonsense, his face a landscape of hard lines and shadows. He was a veteran of the regular army, a different breed from the rest of them, the doughboys, the green recruits, barely out of training. "Yes, Sergeant," Jim replied, his voice a low, steady hum. He was a quiet man, his strength more of a rooted oak than a lightning strike. He was the one who could fix a broken shovel or mend a torn blanket. He was the one who, in the early days, they'd nicknamed Pappy for his patient, steady demeanor. But the gentle soil of Kansas felt 1,000,000 miles away from the brutal, pockmarked landscape of Château-Thierry, which looked more like a moonscape than anything else. A nervous energy vibrated through the small patrol. There was Barney Higgins, a swaggering, bull-necked man from Chicago, whose bravado was as loud as the heavy Browning automatic rifle slung across his back. He was the kind of man who would get in a bar fight for fun, now reduced to a jittery caricature of confidence. "Just another walk in the park," he muttered, the tremor in his hands betraying the tremble in his voice. Beside him was Leo Goldstein, a thin, spectacled idealist from New York. He clutched his rifle like a child holds a teddy bear, a symbol of a duty he still believed in, even as his face was pale with a fear he didn't bother to hide. Miller's voice was a low growl, cutting through the anxiety. "Listen up. We've got a patrol." Jim's stomach tightened. The words were simple, but in this place they meant everything. A reconnaissance patrol, not a charge into enemy fire, but a silent, creeping mission to gather intelligence on the terrain ahead. It was a mission for scouts and observers, a job that called for stealth and quiet, the opposite of a frontal assault. This mission was designed to avoid a fight at all costs, but everyone knew that a reconnaissance patrol that found the enemy had failed in its most fundamental purpose. It meant they had been seen, and that sight was often the last thing a man saw. "We're heading out to map the forward area," Miller explained, his finger tracing a line on a grimy paper map. "The Krauts are quiet. Too quiet. We need to know what they're doing on the other side of that wire." The words hung in the air, heavier than the cold mist that swirled around them. The silence was the enemy now, a predator that could hide anything. A sniper, a machine gun nest, a hidden shell crater. Jim, The farmer knew about the stillness of the land. He knew the difference between the stillness of a summer afternoon and the eerie hush before a storm. The silence out there was a storm waiting to break. As they began their final preparations, checking the straps on their haversacks, the feel of the cold metal of his entrenching tool against his hip was a constant, stark reminder of his new reality. It was a tool for digging, yet Miller had shown them how it could become a blunt, brutal weapon. For Jim, it was a symbol of how everything he knew had been corrupted. With Miller at the lead, they slowly, one by one, began their climb out of the trench, leaving the claustrophobic safety of the earth for the exposed, desolate expanse above. They were just 6 men, a small, fragile knot of flesh and bone moving into a world of endless gray, where the only certainty was the treacherous ground under their feet and the invisible eyes that could be watching from the other side. The world above the trench was a desolate monochromatic canvas painted in shades of gray, mud, and the faded olive of shattered trees. As Jim pulled himself from the hole in the earth, the silence was what struck him first. It was a silence so profound it felt unnatural, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable scream of a shell. He moved with a heavy, plodding rhythm, his senses peeled back, a stark contrast to the quiet of the fields back home, where the sound of wind and crickets filled the air. Here, the absence of sound was a warning, a tension that coiled and tightened with every step. The ground was a ruin, a lunar landscape of overlapping shell craters and jagged stumps of what were once mighty forests. Barbed wire, rusted and treacherous, snaked across the terrain like a network of thorny veins, catching on their uniforms and tearing at their skin. The smell of damp soil was now mixed with something more acrid, a faint scent of burnt cordite that clung to the air and the remnants of shattered trees. Jim kept his head low, his eyes scanning the horizon, a constant, instinctual search for movement, for a hint of life that could mean a German scout, a sniper, or a machine gun nest. Barney, the usually boisterous man from Chicago, moved with a newfound quietness, his heavy Browning automatic rifle feeling less like a source of power and more like a crushing weight on his shoulder. He glanced back at Jim, his eyes wide with a fear that his bravado could no longer conceal. Leo Goldstein, the idealist, looked like a ghost, his face pale and his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. His youthful patriotism, fueled by newspaper headlines about making the world safe for democracy, had been replaced by a palpable, gut-deep terror of the hostile silence. He began to mumble to himself, a low, constant prayer under his breath. Sergeant Miller was a rock, his movements efficient, his head on a swivel. He was the only one who seemed truly at home in this wasteland, a man shaped by war. He held up a hand, and the small patrol froze. Jim watched him with the respect of a man who knows the difference between a real leader and a bully. Miller had a soldier's instinct for the landscape, an innate understanding of how to read the scars of the earth. The patrol continued its slow, painstaking advance, navigating the maze of craters and wire. The suspense was a physical presence in the air, a thick fog that made every shadow a potential enemy, every rustle of a dead leaf a possible alarm. The silence of the landscape was not empty, it was full of possibilities, all of them terrifying. Jim focused on the feel of his boots sinking into the wet earth, the slickness of the rifle stock against his hands. He was trying to ground himself in the physical, to anchor his mind against the rising tide of fear and the disorienting stillness. They had been moving for what felt like an eternity when Miller raised his hand again, this time pointing. Ahead, nestled in a small cluster of shattered trees, was a structure. A small, makeshift hut made of wood and corrugated metal. It was a forward observation post, a silent, empty eye watching their movements. There was no sign of life, no movement, no smoke from a stove. The fact that it was empty was more unsettling than if it had been manned. It meant the enemy was gone, but not without a reason. The question was what that reason was. The patrol had been tasked with reconnaissance, with remaining unseen, but now they had a choice: retreat and report, or push on and see what lay ahead. The decision had to be made quickly, on the fly, with the knowledge that this quiet, empty post might be a trap. The silence of the land had finally given them a problem to solve, and the potential solutions were equally dangerous. The terror in Jim's heart was not of an enemy he could see, but of the one he couldn't, a phantom that stalked the desolate landscape.
The silence that had stalked the patrol for miles was now a tangible thing, thick as dust and heavy with expectation. The small, abandoned observation post sat like a challenge in the shattered landscape, its empty windows staring back at them. The patrol huddled in a nearby crater, the air tasting of burnt earth and something foul and metallic. Barney, his usual bravado now completely gone, licked his dry lips and whispered to Miller, "What do we do, Sarge? It feels wrong." Miller, ever the pragmatist, his face was a study in grim calculation. "It's a scout's job to know what's ahead. We push on. We get a closer look, make sure it's clear, and we mark it. A team of 2, you and me. Thompson, you and Goldstein give us a wide berth and cover our 6. Jim nodded, his grip on his M1917 Enfield tightening. He could hear Leo's shaky breaths, the quiet young man from New York trying to swallow his fear. "Let's go, Leo. Stick close." As Miller and Barney crept forward, melting into the gray landscape, Jim and Leo moved to a flanking position, their eyes locked on the eerie stillness of the post. The wind, what little of it there was, carried a sweet, nauseating scent, a smell Jim's farm-raised nose instinctively registered as rot. A chill ran down his spine. The stillness of the land, he knew, was rarely a good sign. It meant a hunter was nearby. The first sound was not a bang, but a whistle, a high, thin wail that cut through the air and hit Jim's eardrums with a physical impact. He knew it instantly, a sound he had heard in the distance for weeks, but never this close. He yelled, "Incoming!" as the world erupted. An enemy mortar round, likely fired from a hidden position, slammed into the ground just feet from the abandoned post. The explosion was a concussive fist that slammed into Jim, knocking him flat. His ears rang, a high-pitched shriek that drowned out all sound. Dirt and rock rained down on him. For a moment his mind went blank, a white canvas of pure shock. He could taste the metallic grit of his blood in his mouth, the smell of burnt gunpowder and sulfur filling his nostrils. The earth beneath him trembled like a frightened animal. He forced himself to his feet, his mind racing to make sense of the chaos. More explosions tore at the landscape, turning the ground into a churning sea of mud and fire. A machine gun, an unmistakable staccato burst, opened up from a flank they hadn't anticipated. Jim saw Leo, only a few yards away, stumble and fall, his face a mask of terror. A grenade landed with a dull thud beside him, and Jim didn't think, he just acted. He dove forward, tackling Leo as the blast ripped through the air, deafening and hot. But even as he threw himself over his friend, he knew it was too late. The spray of shrapnel was a cold rain against his back, and when he looked down at Leo, the young man's eyes were open, his mouth a silent screaming, "Oh!" His body was broken. The fragile idealism of his past was reduced to a heap of mangled flesh and mud. The vibrant life of the young man from New York who had talked so much of his dreams was snuffed out in a flash of violence. It wasn't heroic. It was just gone. Jim's mind, unable to process the senseless death, slipped into a new kind of focus. He crawled, half blinded by the dust and the adrenaline, to a small rise, his mind now a single-track engine: survival. He saw a German scout, a flash of gray in the gloom, moving through the craters. The man was coming for them, not with a heroic charge, but with a predatory stealth that felt all too familiar. In this close-quarters chaos, his rifle was too long, too cumbersome. His hand found the cold steel of his entrenching tool, the blunt edge of the shovel he had so carefully sharpened back in the trench. The man came around a shell crater, his eyes locked on Jim. Jim didn't hesitate. He swung the tool with a two-handed grip, the same way he would have swung a scythe in his fields. The impact was wet, sickening. The farmer, who had once used this tool to tend to the earth, had now used it to return a man to it. He tasted a new kind of blood, a taste Jim knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. In that moment, the pragmatic man from Kansas died, and a new, colder man was born in the mud of France. The German fire ceased as quickly as it had begun. Miller and Barney, shaken and covered in mud, crawled over to him, their faces pale. Barney's Browning automatic rifle, which had spit fire with such fury moments before, now lay silently at his side. He just stared at it, a blank expression on his face, his lips a thin white line. He was completely silent, his hands trembling. Miller looked at Jim, his eyes wide with a shared horror that needed no words. He pointed back toward their lines. "We go back, now." But Jim didn't move. He just stared at the earth, his mind replaying the sound of the explosion, the feel of the entrenching tool in his hands. He was in a different place, somewhere far from the battle, yet terrifyingly close. He was a man with calloused hands, hands that once held the promise of a peaceful life, but now they were stained with a memory he could never wash away. The trauma, the shell shock, was not a single event, but a cumulative assault on his body and soul. The farmer was gone, and he was left with only the silence and the cold mud.
The journey back was a crawl through a living nightmare, each step a further descent into a reality warped by trauma. The terrain, a pock-marked canvas of gray mud and jagged shell craters, no longer looked like a battlefield to Jim. It was a physical manifestation of his own broken mind, a landscape of raw, exposed wounds. He moved with the slow, disembodied feeling of a man in a dream, his feet heavy and his limbs unresponsive. His focus had narrowed to the simple mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other, a primal rhythm of survival that left no room for thought. The metallic taste of blood was still on his tongue, a ghost sensation that clung to him long after the memory of the fighting had blurred into a chaotic jumble of sound and motion. Sergeant Miller led the way, his shoulders slumped with a weight that Jim had never seen on him before. The veteran's usual confident stride was gone, replaced by a hesitant, stumbling shuffle. He glanced back at Jim and Barney from time to time, his eyes full of a shared horror that didn't need words. The camaraderie they had found in the trenches, the small jokes and quiet understanding, was shattered. It had been a fragile thing, born of shared purpose and a common enemy. But now that purpose was gone, replaced by a devastating unspoken grief for the man they had left behind. Barney, the once boisterous bull of a man, was the most changed. He moved like a puppet with its strings cut, his limbs awkward and uncoordinated. The hand that had so proudly carried the heavy Browning automatic rifle now trembled uncontrollably, and he stared straight ahead, his eyes vacant and unseeing. He was completely silent, his mouth a thin, grim line. His silence was a tangible presence, a void that screamed louder than any shout. Jim understood. There was nothing to say. Words were useless in the face of what they had just witnessed, and to speak would be to give the horror a shape it could not have. It was a shared mutism, a silent agreement to not confront the unspeakable.
Jim's mind was a sieve, unable to hold on to concrete thoughts. He tried to think of his farm, of the scent of his wife's hair, of the simple joy of watching a sunset over the Kansas plains, but the images were fractured and distant, replaced by the persistent phantom sensations of the battle, the sickening crunch of the entrenching tool, the scent of sulfur and burned earth, the high-pitched shriek of an incoming round. The shock shell was not a sudden explosion of madness, but a slow creeping fog that had settled into his bones, leaving him adrift in a reality that felt foreign and hostile. The world had gone from black and light to a dizzying array of grays, each one a shade of loss and fear. They finally reached the lip of their own trench, the familiar barbed wire and zigzagging walls a welcome sight. But it wasn't. The sight of other men, laughing, playing cards, and talking about food, was jarring. Their casual normalcy was a slap in the face. Their world was ordered, mundane, and safe, a world Jim and his patrol had just been thrown out of. The conversations were a cacophony of sound, a deafening noise that made Jim's head ache. He couldn't understand the words. They were speaking the same language, but they belonged to two different worlds. He saw one man, his face a soft, unlined canvas, complaining about a lack of tobacco, and Jim felt a hot, venomous rage rise in his throat. What right did this man have to complain? Miller, seeing the look on Jim's face, placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture of warning and shared suffering. "Down we go," he said, his voice a low rasp. They descended back into the earth, back into the foul-smelling, cramped confines of the trench that had once been their sanctuary. It felt like a trap now, a suffocating box that held them captive with their memories. Jim found his place and sat, his rifle resting beside him, the cold steel feeling strangely alien in his hands. He was a man without a country, without a past. He had walked out as a farmer, a husband, a whole person. He had returned a ghost, a survivor haunted by the ghost of a boy he had known, a ghost that smelled of mud and burnt earth. The true journey, he realized, was not the return to the trench, but the impossible task of finding his way back to himself.
The return was not a homecoming. It was an intrusion. As the three surviving men stumbled back into the trench, the smells of cooking food and the low hums of conversation felt like an assault on their senses. They had just come back from a place of death and silent horror, and here, life continued with a shocking, banal normalcy. For Jim, the chattering voices were a cruel mockery, the faces of the other soldiers soft and unlined, their eyes holding a calm he no longer possessed. They hadn't been to the moonscape of no man's land. They hadn't seen the way the mud devoured a man's life without a sound. Barney, the once swaggering operario, stood perfectly still, his body rigid. The tremor that had started in his hands was now a full-body shudder. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at nothing, as if he were replaying a film only he could see. A medic approached him, his voice a concerned murmur, but Barney didn't respond. He had no words. His vocal cords, like his will to fight, seemed to have been severed by the sheer terror he had witnessed. He was a statue of despair, a monument to the violence that had broken him from the inside out. Jim felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sergeant Miller's face, a mask of cold resignation. Miller had survived, but something vital had been extinguished in him. He gave a brief, wordless nod toward their dugout, a place they could hide from the world that was no longer theirs. But before they could retreat, an officer approached, his face a mix of frustration and inquiry. "What happened out there, Thompson? Where are the others? What did you find?" he demanded, his voice too loud in the quiet of the trench. Jim's mouth was dry. He opened it to speak, but no words came out. His mind raced, grasping for an answer, a way to explain the sound of the whistling shell, the taste of blood, the feel of the entrenching tool in his hands. He tried to articulate the sight of Leo's still broken body, the silent horror on Barney's face, but the words were stuck, choked by a sudden intense feeling of dread and helplessness. He could not reason, he could not speak. The farmer, the man of simple, clear purpose, was gone, replaced by a ghost of a man who could no longer articulate his own story. He was experiencing the crushing mutism of shell shock, a silent wound that went deeper than any physical injury. The officer, seeing his vacant stare, his inability to respond, muttered something about the stress of combat and walked away, shaking his head. To the man who hadn't been there, Jim's silence was a sign of weakness, but to Jim it was the only way he could exist. He felt a deep, profound disconnect from his own reality. He was just a body, a vessel carrying the interminable memories of a traumatic event that he could not, and would not, be able to process. He finally made his way back to his small corner of the dugout. The air was stale, smelling of earth and the unwashed men he had come to know. He sat down, his rifle propped against the wall. The world had lost its texture. The coarse feel of the canvas haversack against his back, the cold steel of the M1917 Enfield, all of it was just a sensation, not a reality. He was adrift. He was no longer Jim, the farmer. He was just a man in a trench, a man who had lost his purpose and his identity in a field of mud and broken bodies. His old life, his love, his hope for a peaceful farm felt like a story someone else had told him, a distant and unreachable memory. He reached into his pocket and took out a folded letter. It was from his fiancée back home. He opened it, his eyes scanning her familiar, looping script. He read the final line, a promise he had once given her, a line of simple hope that now seemed so impossibly far away. "If I don't come back, take my hope for peace to our farm." But the truth was, he had come back. His body had, at least. But the farmer who had left was gone. He sat there a silent, hollow shell, the words on the page a cruel testament to the man he once was. He was a survivor, yes, but he had left the most essential part of himself behind in the mud of Château-Thierry.